edition of a classic Gothic text, and the chances are it has Nick's simultaneously magisterial, authoritative, and ideally unobtrusive editorial accompaniment. So Nick's talk for us today combines many of these aspects of his work, unfolding the tangled true story, reaching out of a remote reimagined past of the modern vampire. The title of his talk is Polidori's Vampire: Deception, Delusion, Delirium. Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom, for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here, if only on Zoom. Now, I imagine that most of you know the story of the gathering at the Via Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva during the summer of 1816, the year without a summer. Lord Byron was at the villa with his physician, Dr. John Polidori. Staying a short walk away and frequently visiting were Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Godwin, who would marry Percy at the end of the year, and Claire Clairmont. One stormy night, they were reading ghostly tales, and Byron challenged the company each to write a ghost story. Out of this emerged the novels Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Polidori's Ernestus Berchtold. And although Byron's tale remained unfinished, Polidori claimed to have completed it over the summer and given it the title The Vampire. Subsequently lost, it reappeared in 1819, published in the New Monthly Magazine. Somewhat mysterious circumstances accompanied it. A few months later, Byron's original of his vampire story, A Fragment, was published by John Murray without Byron's express permission. Now, I'm going to begin this talk by explaining how I came to write this paper, as it may be of help, particularly to graduate students, to have a sense of how a piece of original research comes into being, and also how different it can be from one's original idea. So the story begins a decade ago when I was writing the Gothic, and realized that despite the huge amount of work on the Gothic, the term had never been consistently historicized. And so this book is characterized by a long historicist perspective. And that in turn led to various invitations to write papers rehistoricizing the Gothic, particularly the early 18th century Gothic, including one for a collection of essays on Dracula. And the wealth of material I gathered for that on the figure of the vampire before Dracula indicated that there was a book there. So that's what appeared in 2018. And this book, of course, covers Polidori's The Vampire. It included a section on the influence of vampirology on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I then began work on an edition of various romantic and Victorian vampire tales, which might come out looking like this. It's virtually finished. This is my idea of the cover. This is a fake, in other words. It's a fake cover. And one of the first stories I edited for this was Polidori's Vampire. I began the headnote, which I expected to be a couple of paragraphs long, but as I tried to piece together the tangled facts of publication, a far more complicated picture emerged. 10,000 words later, I had a new account of the composition and publication of The Vampire. And for the graduate students who are here this evening, I cannot stress too highly that this was essentially the result of going back through all the primary sources, checking earlier scholarship, and being somewhat skeptical of Polidori's own claims. After discussing the work with the editor of the Journal of Romanticism and swinging revision to get it to an acceptable length, my new account was sent to the journal and was published a few weeks ago. However, on the very day I submitted it to the journal, I received the latest copy of Gothic Studies, which contained a 13-page article with the following title: A Note on the Publication History of John Polidori's The Vampire. Now, I'd like to reassure any graduate students that this sort of thing doesn't happen very often. It's the first time it's happened to me so dramatically. And once I'd read the article, I realized that although the author, Fabio Camietti, had identified a few of the discrepancies that I had analysed, my own work went further in challenging and rewriting the standard account. More positively, Camiette's article provided an immediate scholarly context for my own work. So my article on the publication of The Vampire argues through an accumulation of external evidence, I won't go into that here, The Vampire was likely to have been written as late as March 1819 in order to be published in the April 1819 edition of the New Monthly Magazine. At the same time, and having by now lived with Polidori's tale for some months, I had an idea that it was rather more sophisticated than most critics allowed. One of the modern features of horror stories and films is the climatic, unexpected reversal or sudden collapse of a reader's or viewer's assumptions. For example, the jump out of your seat moment at the end of the 1976 film Carrie. Franco Moretti offers an intriguing, if to my mind ultimately unconvincing, reading of Dracula, in which he argues that Quincy Morris is a vampire, suggesting that the Harker's baby at the end of the novel, named Quincy in memory of the American, is infected with vampirism, thus carrying the condition on to the next generation. I don't think there's enough evidence in the text for this, but it set me thinking about Polidori's vampire. Could it be about the vampirization of Aubrey? And my way into this was via my argument that the tale was written in 1819, which allowed me to examine the influence of Frankenstein on the vampire. Polidori's tale, The Vampire, is arguably the most influential and significant short prose tale of the Romantic period. Its relationship with Byron's A Fragment was vehemently debated at the time, but the more subtle and sophisticated traces of Frankenstein have been generally overlooked. And that's due primarily to the uncritical acceptance of Polidori's claim that The Vampire was composed in the summer of 1816, rather than at some point after Shelley's novel appeared on the 1st of January 1818. So when I came to write the following paper, which is due to be published in a collection edited by Bill Hughes and Sam George later this year, although I had already shown that Frankenstein reverberates with vampire thinking, there was now a new possibility. If The Vampire was written after Frankenstein, after Polidori had read Frankenstein, then it should be possible to trace the direct influence of Shelley's novel on Polidori's text. Consequently, I wrote the paper as a close reading to provide internal evidence for a much later date of composition. So this paper explains how Frankenstein unlocks latent meanings in Polidori's text through internal evidence. And I think that it strongly supports my contention that it could only have been written after he had read Shelley's novel. Moreover, while the character Aubrey has often been seen as a self-portrait of Polidori himself, and it's generally accepted that the vampire, Lord Riven, is an audacious attack on Byron, who employed Polidori as his personal physician in 1816, I argue that these correlations are not so clear-cut. They're ultimately untenable. This paper accordingly presents a close reading of the character of Aubrey, informed by Mary Shelley's presentation of Victor Frankenstein, to reveal that the relationship between Aubrey and Riven is far more complex and radical than has hitherto been recognised. For the maverick scientist Victor Frankenstein, the being he has fashioned from the carcasses of humans and beasts and brought to life with the blood of living animals is akin to my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. His use of the word vampire combining literal and figurative meanings of the word. Frankenstein is therefore not only soaked in the imagery and ties of blood, but throbs with cardiovascular circulation. Blood is felt pulsing through veins, blood is chilled or curdled or boils, and bloodthirsty revenge drives the plot. Blood will have blood. Victims of the being, meanwhile, are bloodless. Such vampirology was transfused into Frankenstein through the late night conversations about bioscience and the ghost stories and Gothic poetry read at Diodati. Shelley later claimed that many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. In fact, it was probably Polidori who led these symposia. He held a medical degree and had researched psychosomatic phenomena such as somnambulism or sleepwalking. On the 15th of June, 2 days before Byron proposed the ghost story challenge, Polidori recorded in his diary that Percy Shelley and I had a conversation about principles, whether man was to be thought merely an instrument. But that would seem to be the kernel of truth at the heart of Mary Shelley's anecdotes. And the risen dead, if not actual vampires, do pace through Shelley's novel in figurative language as phantasms. The being is a demonical corpse, a mummy, and to the hallucinating victor, the spirits of the dead hover round in the forms of the beloved dead flit before me. Despite its rational scientific Gothicism, then, there remain shades of the supernatural in Frankenstein, and reading the novel must have revived many memories of that dark and stormy summer for Polidori. Shelley's novel consequently casts a long shadow over the vampire. From the very outset, both narratives have the poetic imagination playing a central role. In Frankenstein, the narrator, Captain Robert Walton, claims that his education was neglected, yet he was passionately fond of reading, and as a young man had entertained grand literary aspirations, reading the works of those poets whose effusions entranced my soul and lifted it to heaven. The result, I also became a poet, and for 1 year lived in a paradise of my own creation. He's remained a fervent and vivid daydreamer in search of experience and the intellectual companionship he identifies in Victor. In The Vampire, Aubrey, while not a practicing poet himself, also had erratic schooling from mercenary subalterns. As a result, like Walton, he cultivated more his imagination than his judgment. He had that high romantic feeling of honour and candour which daily ruins so many milliners' apprentices. It's quite a sort of feminine association. And a natural sympathy with virtue, believing that vice was thrown in by Providence merely for the picturesque effect of the scene, as we see in romances. In short, he thought that the dreams of poets were the realities of life. Although, like Walton, Aubrey becomes disillusioned by these flights of imagination, he nevertheless imagines Riven as the hero of a romance, not a person, but the offspring of his fancy, much as Walton figures Victor. For his own part, Riven had the reputation of a winning tongue, his eloquence being the serpent's art. Who could resist his power? Just as Victor describes the being as eloquent and persuasive, once his words even had power over my heart. To take this Aubrey, Victor, Riven being analogy further, Tony Jackson has observed that Frankenstein is a novel of appearance and perception. The text is thick with images of eyes and elaborately described acts of seeing. There is a literally morbid fascination with the complexion and physical appearance of the being, who, as you know, is luridly figured with yellow skin, lustrous black hair, pearly white teeth, watery eyes, a shriveled complexion and straight black lips. Similarly, The Vampire is a story of seeing and being seen. Lord Riven is straightway noted for his peculiarities, for his dead grey eye and the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion. His eyes are oddly unseeing. For Lady Mercer, for instance, though his eyes were apparently fixed upon hers, still it seemed as if they were unperceived. While the being is of superhuman speed, Riven's strength seemed superhuman. Both have uncanny skills of evasion. Indeed, both live on beyond the end of their respective narratives. Both ride on the wings of the storm. Victor returns to Geneva during a terrific thunderstorm in which, by flashes of lightning, he glimpses the being for the first time since he was brought to unlife. Later, the being arrives on Victor's wedding night as a sudden storm breaks. Aubrey, meanwhile, stumbles upon the hovel in the Vampire Woods by the glare of lightning. Riven does not, of course, inspire the same sort of controversial sympathy that the being has, but he does have the same incandescent temper and is even attributed the same death toll as the being's number of direct victims. Ianthe, the Countess's daughter, and Miss Aubrey, which mirror William, Elizabeth, and Henri Clerval. Both also inspire murderous intent. Victor springs at the being to extinguish the spark that I had so negligently bestowed, whereas Aubrey thought of employing his own hand to free the world from such a wretch. Throughout both texts, the moon is particularly significant for these near humans. As Victor works, the moon gazed on my midnight labours, and the being is animated by the dim and yellow light of the moon as it forced its way through the window shutters. He subsequently reckons time by lunar phases and finds his way by the lovely moon. The she-being is created on Orkney when the moon is just rising from the sea, the being himself scrutinising Victor's work by the light of the moon. Victor ultimately disposes of her dismembered flesh under a moonlit sky. He later glimpses the being in the pale yellow light of the moon, and again, suddenly the broad disk of the moon arose and shone full upon his ghastly and distorted shape as he fled with more than mortal speed. If for the being, moonlight is the medium of creation, for Riven in the Vampyre, it appears to be the agency of recreation. In classical medical theory and practice, the moon had generative powers and was strongly linked to pregnancy and childbirth. The supposed humidity of moonbeams was thought to cause both the ripening and then the rotting of fruit and vegetables, as well as the associated phenomenon of fermentation, and also curdling and even putrefaction in meat. Furthermore, its effect on the moist organs of the body could cause cataracts, headaches, and lunacy. And the flow of blood waxed and waned with the moon's cycles, in turn affecting the ebb and flow of fever. The moon also had long established associations with witchcraft, particularly the evil eye, and could be milked for its potent fluid. Now, Riven supposedly rises from the dead through moonlight, as well as the intervention of robbers that he's already instructed. And this is a sort of a guerrilla force that Bram Stoker later adapted in Dracula. His corpse is exposed to the first cold ray of the moon that rose after his death, whereupon his body disappears. Perhaps the most telling kinship between the being and Riven, however, is their shared use of the oath. For the being, it's a repeated threat. Remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night. And for Victor, the words of the fiend rung in my ears like a death knell. In consequence, after the murder of Elizabeth, he swears his own vengeance in an oath to pursue the being. In the Vampyre, however, the dire responsibility of such an utterance has shifted from the persecutor to the persecuted. Aubrey has made an oath to Riven to save my honour, your friend's honour, upon his own honour as a gentleman, something that Polidori himself valued very highly. Aubrey swears an oath not to report Riven's death in England, meaning that he effectively remains alive there. Swear, whatever may happen or whatever you may see. Aubrey swears, Riven dies laughing, and Aubrey is henceforth unrelentingly reminded of his vow, controlled by Riven from beyond the grave. Remember your oath, commands the undead Riven, again and again, until finally, remember your oath, and know, if not my bride today, your sister is dishonoured. Now, Aubrey's death knell is therefore his unspeakable word. The being's threat and Riven's oath both focus on the relationships of the central character to women. Victor with Elizabeth Lavenza and Aubrey with Ianthe and his sister, only ever referred to as Miss Aubrey. Here too there are repeated motifs. Elizabeth in the 1818 edition of Frankenstein is Victor's ethereal cousin. Her figure was light and airy, and she busied herself in following the aerial creations of the poets. Ianthe too has a light step. She's a fairy form and is allied to the arts and even the celestial. So beautiful and delicate, but she might have formed a model for a painter wishing to portray on canvas the promised hope of the faithful in Muhammad's paradise. Her guileless purity is in stark contrast to the knowing shamelessness of Riven's liaisons. Hers is innocence, youth, and beauty, unaffected by crowded drawing rooms and stifling balls. Despite the social gulf, Aubrey takes the parental role of guardian to this frank infantile being. Miss Aubrey too requires the protection of Aubrey when she enters society. She's a sedate and pensive 18. She's a soul conscious of a brighter realm, and exhibits a melancholy charm rather than vivaciousness, a despondency that's shared by Aubrey, who would rather have remained in the mansion of his fathers and fed upon the melancholy which overpowered him. Both Victor and Aubrey have deep ties to these women through blood and through marriage, fatally thwarted for Elizabeth and Ianthe, and fatally consummated for Miss Aubrey. They are also defined by the creative imagination. If Ianthe herself is a walking work of art, one of the instruments of the calamities that befall Elizabeth and Miss Aubrey, and therefore Victor and Aubrey themselves, is a miniature painting of a loved one, a mother or fiancée. William persuades Elizabeth to lend him a very valuable miniature that she possessed of Victor's mother, and this is understood to have brought about William's murder, although only Victor is told that it is direct revenge visited upon his family by the being. The miniature also affords the means by which Justine is framed for the crime, the incriminating evidence being planted on her while she sleeps, and she is duly executed. In The Vampyre, on the eve of Miss Aubrey's wedding to the Earl of Marsden, Aubrey opens a locket of hers and gazes upon a miniature that he recognises as the features of the monster who had so long influenced his life, and he straightway destroys it. In both instances, then, the artwork not only has lethal qualities, it's transformative in that it provokes ferocious rage. This rage is homicidal in the case of the being, but for Aubrey too, it confirms that he himself has become some sort of monster. Indeed, as Patricia Scarder suggests, the rage implies connection between the envier Aubrey and the envied vampire, who displaces Aubrey as the sister's protector and insinuates himself into the sister's affection. Elizabeth blames herself for William's murder. "Oh God, I've murdered my darling infant," sentiments appropriated by Victor when he discovers that Henri Clerval has been killed. "Have my murderous machinations deprived you, my dearest Henri, of life? Two I have already destroyed." He repeats his charge against himself that I am the cause of this. William, Justine, and Henri, they all died by my hands. When Aubrey returns to Ianthe's parents after her death, they looked at Aubrey and pointed to the corpse as if in accusation before dying broken-hearted. Aubrey himself accepts the blame. During his convalescence, he becomes delirious, calling on Riven to spare Ianthe, while at other times he would imprecate maledictions upon his head and curse him as her destroyer. And yet the pronouns here are ambiguous. They're simultaneously both an accusation against Riven and Aubrey's own confession of guilt. As to Riven's vulturine courtship of Miss Aubrey, in the mind of her brother, he's certainly in some sense responsible, as Riven, seemingly hearing of Aubrey's relapse, hastens to his house, and by constant attendance and the pretence of great affection for the brother and interest in his fate, he gradually won the ear of Miss Aubrey. In the context of such catastrophes, the physical and mental collapse of both Victor and Aubrey is depicted in pathological detail. When Victor is rescued from the ice fields, Walton writes that his body was dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. Moreover, he is generally melancholic and despairing, and sometimes gnashes his teeth as if impatient of the weight of woes that oppresses him. All in all, I never saw a man so wretched, in so wretched a condition. It transpires that this is only the latest in a series of breakdowns that Victor has suffered since his fateful experiment. When he first animates the being, he does so in a fever. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. He paces up and down his bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. Eventually falling into slumber, he is disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, but as I imprinted the first kiss upon her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. Victor roams the streets with irregular steps, plagued by the remembrance of lines from the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. He dare not return to his chambers, but felt impelled to hurry on, although wetted by the rain, which poured from a black and comfortless sky. When Clerval arrives, he notices how very ill Victor appears, so thin and pale. Victor's nervous fever confines him for several months. During all that time, Henri was my only nurse. He knew that I could not have had a more kind and attentive nurse than himself. This post-traumatic condition recurs when Victor works on the abortive she-being on Orkney. He walks about the isle like a restless spectre, and when he escapes to Ireland, succumbs to fever and remains for 2 months on the point of death. Once again, he is a physical wreck, a walking cadaver of emaciated frame and feverish cheeks, and once again benefits from the care of a man, Mr. Kerwin, who, unlike the unsympathetic and elderly female domestic to whom Victor is first entrusted, shows him extreme kindness. Notwithstanding this, Victor is afterwards declared insane and incarcerated for some months. Now, Polidori replicates Shelley's accounts of Victor's distress in the states of shock experienced by Aubrey following the murder of Ianthe and then the apparent post-mortem return of Riven. Like Victor, Aubrey is put to bed and seized with the most violent fever and was often delirious. Like Victor, he is nursed by a male companion. Riven, chancing to be in the same city as Aubrey and hearing of his disturbed state, immediately placed himself in the same house and became his constant attendant. Riven, uncharacteristically, speaks kind words and almost repents of his erstwhile vices. Indeed, his lordship seems quite changed, more like Aubrey, in fact, but reverts to his former state once Aubrey recovers. Thus the two are paired. When Aubrey is delirious, Riven is compassionate. When Aubrey recovers his senses, Riven becomes monstrous, and Aubrey perceives a smile of malicious exultation playing upon his lips. After his first illness, Aubrey can no longer find solitude among the ruins in the woods, much as Victor has a nightmare that compounds Elizabeth dying with his decomposing mother. Ianthe appears to Aubrey as the living dead, bleeding from her fatal injury, her pale face and wounded throat with a meek smile upon her lips. When, like Victor, Aubrey falls ill a second time, he again lapses into solitude, not eating. Then, much as Victor, he left the house, roamed from street to street, and was anxious to fly that image that haunted him. His dress became neglected, and he wandered, as often exposed to the noonday sun and to the midnight damps. Aubrey is no longer recognisable. He regresses, he becomes feral. At first he returned with the evening to the house, but at last he laid him down to rest wherever fatigue overtook him. Although his sister employs servants to follow him, they were soon distanced. Aubrey, like Victor, is in flight from a pursuer swifter than any. In his case, it's from thought. He speaks in disconcerting riddles. He only uttered a few words, and those terrified her, and he is confined as insane, another incarceration and another replication of Victor's troubles. In this wretched condition, Aubrey writes a letter to his sister, but it's intercepted by his physician and judged to be the ravings of a maniac. Other figures also hang over Aubrey. The image of me, hang on a minute. I'll carry on talking, but the image should come back in a moment. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. So other figures also hang over Victor and Aubrey. I do apologise. I don't know whether you can hear. Can you still hear me? Can you see the screen share? If you can still see the share, then I'll carry on talking.
Yep, we can see the screen share.
Right, the video's come back now, I think. So other figures also hang over Victor and Aubrey. On a handful of occasions, Shelley seems to have been drawing directly on Polidori for elements of Victor and his behaviour. Both are brilliant medical students. Polidori was aged just 19 when he graduated as Doctor of Medicine from Edinburgh University. But it is Victor's solitary boat trips that remind one most of Polidori's time at Diodati. He recorded in his diary that he frequently rowed across Lake Geneva. On one such outing, he got his boat to the middle of the lake, and there lay my length, letting the boat go its way. Another time, he rowed Mary around the lake all night till 9. We tea'd together, chatted, etc. Victor, back with his family at Geneva, recalled that often, after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took a boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course and gave way to my own miserable reflections. Now, Scarda suggests that Aubrey is possibly a portrait of Polidori, reading the Vampyre as Polidori's attempts to balance Byron's colossal literary reputation. Hence, as Simon Bainbridge has observed, Polidori's tale can be read as warning of the perceived threat of the Byronic text to its readers. Bainbridge goes further, treating the Vampyre as a story of the double that presents a struggle between two opposing parts of the self, with Aubrey's social and moral values and his sense of the real, already weak at the opening of the story, coming increasingly under threat from the transgressive desires and appetites associated with Riven and Byronic romance. Bainbridge's thought-provoking analysis of the double certainly deserves serious attention, but the paralleling of Byron Polidori with Riven Aubrey is an easy equation that ignores other key relationships in the text that have no clear analogy at the time. Polidori spent the time Polidori spent with Byron. What of Aubrey and Ianthe, Aubrey and his sister, and Aubrey and the Countess? Likewise, the tensions at Diodati and subsequently between Polidori and the Byron circle are not evident in the Vampyre. So Polidori's devotion to Mary Shelley, for example. On the very day Polidori began his own ghost story, Mary called him her younger brother. In fact, he was 2 years older than she was. He also read with her, assisted with the vaccination of her son William, and they dined together several times. In contrast, he apparently quarrelled several times with Percy and threatened to shoot him one day on the water. The Shelley-Godwin menage with Byron and Claremont and the eventual and sometimes violent summer they spent together is part of the compelling entanglement of sexual libertinism and exhilarating poetry in which Polidori, as an employee of Byron's rather than an equal, occupied an uncomfortable and ambiguous position. All of this could have provided material for the Vampyre, but actually appears to have contributed very little. Instead, Polidori took his principal inspiration from the tales of Byron and Shelley written for the Ghost Story Challenge. Besides, when the Vampyre was published in 1819, it was prefaced by a letter that idolised Byron and which, being derived almost entirely from Polidori's journal, was either written by him or with his consent and cooperation. To represent the central Riven-Aubrey relationship as signifying Byron Polidori needs then to be re-examined. Aubrey and Riven arrive in London at about the same time. They meet, and in the opening words of the third paragraph, he watched him. Well, the lack of proper nouns makes the remark unsettlingly ambiguous. Who is watching whom? Riven is a man entirely absorbed in himself, who does not appear to perceive or even address women. Aubrey, in contrast, is handsome, rich, and frank. And at least the first two qualities the opposite to Riven, and is so courted by mothers eager to find a match for their daughters. The two men also differ in their respective wealth, Aubrey learning that Lord Riven's affairs were embarrassed. Although once abroad, Aubrey sees that Riven is in fact profuse in his liberality to the idle the vagabond and the beggar, although the charity is cursed. Riven thus becomes Aubrey's alter ego. When Aubrey resolves to undertake a tour of the continent, Riven, as Aubrey's companion, seeks the centres of all fashionable vice. Riven rewards the profligate while blasting young hopes and beggaring entire families. And indeed, Aubrey is certainly the sort of affluent young gentleman that Riven ostensibly delights in destroying. So Aubrey's continued companionship with the Lord is almost implies a death wish on his part. It's a fatal fascination with a diabolical entity into whose clutches he has fallen. And that, to Aubrey's exalted imagination, began to assume the appearance of something supernatural. While they're in Rome, Aubrey then devotes himself to classical archaeology. Following a letter from Aubrey's guardians informing him that in England, Riven is considered an evil power that delights in corrupting the most virtuous and innocent, Aubrey shadows Riven and realizes that he intends to debauch the daughter of an Italian countess. He confronts the malefactor, warns the girl's family, and then leaves his iniquitous company. Riven simply laughs. The conflict between Aubrey and Riven is therefore fought out over female bodies, each seeking to exercise control over feminine flesh, if in different ways. Yet it might also be the case that Riven is unmasking the unacknowledged desires of Aubrey, that he has a sordid fantasy of wish fulfillment. The Skada, by focusing on Riven's female victims, Polidori obscures the more significant and more subtly incestuous seduction and death of Aubrey. In fact, it is through Ianthe that Aubrey learns of the living vampire, who had passed years amidst his friends and dearest ties by feeding upon the life of a lovely you can still hear me? Sorry. So it's in fact through Ianthe that Aubrey learns of the living vampire, who has passed years amidst his friends and dearest ties, forced every year by feeding upon the life of a lovely female to prolong his existence for the ensuing months. He deems Ianthe's account of the vampire's physical details a pretty accurate description of Lord Riven, but he also finds it risible. But in comportment, Riven is a singularity, a lone wolf. It is actually Aubrey who has friends and dearest ties. Ianthe distracts Aubrey with the vampire beliefs while he researches ancient archaeological sites. She also distracts him with her beauty. But without Ianthe, the ruins begin to beguile Aubrey. He visits a remote site, becomes absorbed, breaks his promise to return before nightfall, and during a storm is lost in a particular wood, the resort of the vampires in their nocturnal orgies. Chancing on a hovel, he hears a woman shrieking and a man's laughter in one almost unbroken sound, as if they are one and the same, foreshadowing what is to come. Breaking in, he grapples with a being who tries to strangle him before his assailant is interrupted by lights outside and, it seems, flees. Woodsmen enter to find Aubrey recovering and then Ianthe dead. Upon her neck and breast was blood, and upon her throat the marks of teeth having opened the vein. She is the victim of a vampire. There is also a weapon at the scene. Aubrey held almost unconsciously in his hand a naked dagger of a particular construction which had been found in the hut. Well, at least that's one version of events. There are several unanswered questions here. What was Ianthe doing in the very place and at the very time she had pleaded with Aubrey to avoid? What does the vampire mean when, wrestling with Aubrey, he proclaims, "again baffled," and then laughs? Why do the woodsmen arrive so opportunely? What is the significance of the suspicious dagger in Aubrey's hand? And what precisely is Aubrey's role in all this? Is he the unwitting agent of some sort of malign archaic power he has disturbed among the mysterious ruins, or a focus for Riven's elaborate machinations? In the immediate aftermath of this episode, Aubrey suffers a breakdown, through which he is cared for by none other than Riven. Returning to consciousness, Aubrey is initially horrified at the sight of him whose image he had now combined with that of a vampire, but they nonetheless form a new bond. Once Aubrey has recovered, they again travel together, but during their adventures, Riven is shot and dies, and his body is lost or vanishes. Aubrey is understandably shocked and re-traumatized by the experience. He did not sleep and is haunted by Riven. The many circumstances attending his acquaintance with this man rose upon his mind, and he knew not why. Aubrey is also panicked by having sworn the dying man's oath, and whenever he recalls it, is struck with cold shivering. It preys on his mind as if from the presentiment of something horrible awaiting him. Aubrey, deciding to leave Greece, then discovers several weapons among Riven's effects, including the sheath of the dagger found at the scene of Ianthe's death. There is blood on both of them. He then learns that the Countess's daughter has now disappeared. Polidori seems unequivocally to be disclosing that Riven is the guilty party here. He is the vampire who killed Ianthe and who then attacked Aubrey. But this is a reading preoccupied by reading Riven as Byron. There is in fact another candidate. Simon Bainbridge's idea that Polidori's text can be read as a story of doubling, with the vampire Riven as a projection of Aubrey's repressed desires, which he both enacts in displaced form and prevents from being enacted through the murder of the object of desire. So in such an interpretation, Riven murders Ianthe and Miss Aubrey as a displaced enactment of Aubrey's own possessive and prohibited desire, and as a forestalling of any actual enactment through death. And Bainbridge is, I think, half right in this suggestion. But it's worth following the plot closely from Ianthe's death to the end of the tale, as there are more, and in fact more sensational clues that reveal Aubrey's increasingly vampiric behaviour. So, quitting Greece, Aubrey almost breaks down again on learning about the disappearance of the Countess's daughter and becomes morose and silent, not unlike Riven. He speeds back to England on a breeze which seemed obedient to his will. In East European legend, vampires have control over the weather. Back in England and in society, Aubrey appears to be concurrently occupying two times and perhaps two places, standing in a corner by himself, heedless of all around him, at the same time engaged in the remembrance of the first time he had seen Lord Riven. He believes he is seized by his arm, hears the words, "Remember your oath," and then sees Riven in front of him at a little distance. So it's an uncanny repetition of the first time he had seen the Lord, the same figure which had attracted his notice on this spot upon his first entry into society. So Riven is speaking in Aubrey's mind, physically gripping his arm from behind and simultaneously standing some way in front of him. Aubrey practically collapses and has to be taken home. It should hardly be worth emphasising, though it clearly does in the light of other readings of the text, that Aubrey's account is already wholly deranged. Fearing that the dead rise again, but that it is impossible that the vision of Riven could be real, Aubrey makes a second visit into society. Riven, whose name itself suggests duality and the Riven self within, is already inside Aubrey, at his teeth no less, Riven's name hung upon his lips, while Aubrey is prey to vampirically devouring thoughts. Aubrey then apparently perceives Riven to have fallen into company with his sister, although this is in fact an image conjured up by his imagination. In a repetition of Riven apparently seizing his arm, Aubrey seizes his sister's arm and forces her away, as if rehearsing her abduction. His oath dominates his thoughts. Was he then to allow this monster to roam, bearing ruin upon his breath, amidst all he held dear? But again, that last pronoun is ambiguous. It is Aubrey who is now the perpetrator of sexual crimes. Riven is and remains dead. Aubrey becomes a recluse, shunning human contact. For days, he remained in this state, shut up in his room, and saw no one. But then, resolving to warn against what he presumes to be Riven's fiendish intentions, Aubrey then has to face the uncomfortable truth that he himself is now regarded as aberrant and freakish. For when he entered into a room, his haggard and suspicious looks was so striking, his inward shuddering so visible, that his sister was at last obliged to beg of him to abstain from seeking a society which affected him so strongly. Aubrey's humanity has evaporated. His guardians fear that his mind was becoming alienated, and they engage a physician to reside in the house. He hardly appeared to notice it. Incoherent, he was eventually locked in his chamber. There, he would often lie for days, incapable of being roused. He had become emaciated, his eyes had attained a glassy lustre. Lying for days, catatonic, emaciated, corpse-like, with Riven's blank and unseeing stare, Aubrey is like a vampire, starved of sustenance. The only person who can rouse him is, calculatingly, his sister. He would sometimes start, and seizing her hands, he would desire her not to touch him. Oh, so do not touch him. If your love for me is aught, do not go near him. Once more, the use of the pronouns he and him conflates his own identity with that of his unreal demon brother. Riven is an abiding, if increasingly phantasmic presence, who has been allowed to possess Aubrey in order to excuse Aubrey's own excesses, which accounts for Aubrey internalizing the oath and why he is therefore incapable of breaking it without ruinous psychological damage. This sanctions assimilation of the two identities, one dead, by Aubrey himself is consensual vampirism. It's also insane. Although Aubrey appears gradually to be recovering his senses as the year and a day's silence he swore comes to an end, he in fact remains utterly mad, and it is important that his perceptions and actions are understood as such. Hearing of his sister's marriage, he is hysterical with love for her until he opens her locket. He believes he sees a miniature of Riven, the vehicle of his fantasies, and the medium of his own incestuous desire for his sister, but the painting is effectively a mirror in which he comprehends himself as the monster. In a paroxysm of rage, Aubrey tramples the trinket, but straightway hears Riven inside his head, restating the oath. Moreover, he turns suddenly around, thinking Lord Riven was near him, but saw no one. Riven is indeed near him, as close as he can be, closer than an eye, as Dr. Jekyll describes Mr. Hyde. Aubrey then fantasizes that it was Riven's constant attendance during his renewed illness that gave him access to his sister, a psychological attempt to rationalize his incestuous desire by once more blaming it on the imagined Riven, while at the same time admitting his own complicity. There is only one person who could be so close to Aubrey at all these times. It is not Riven, it is Aubrey himself. As the wedding hour approaches, Aubrey grows increasingly crazed. He escapes his incarceration and comes face to face with Riven, who is preparing to marry. Aubrey's mania is manifested in beholding his double, in his own mind, as the incarnation of his rage. Again, he imagines he is grasped by or in the grip of Riven. The things duly end in blood. Aubrey's passion, not finding vent, had broken a blood vessel. His sister is seemingly married, and Aubrey's weakness increased. The effusion of blood produced symptoms of the near approach of death. His end is a repetition of Riven's last hours. And although he does not prematurely rot, Aubrey does speak, justifying himself in a fantastical self-fashioning testimony. It's telling that Aubrey's final moments at midnight also reenact the ghost story challenge of the Via Diodati, and Lord Byron related with composure a fragment, his vampire story. And that was Polidori's guilty source for the vampire, a story whose influence he could neither escape nor adequately explain. In the last line of his own story, we learn that Aubrey's sister had glutted the thirst of a vampire. So the blood with which Aubrey is covered is not his own, but that of Miss Aubrey. Aubrey is dead. Riven, already in reality dead, disappears as a figment of a dead imagination, and the duplicitous tale of the vampire has been told. Aubrey and Riven appear at the same time as two individuals. They disappear at the same time as one, by which time Riven exists wholly within Aubrey's mind, whose delusions shape the world around him. They start to merge when Aubrey begins to slake his vicious and ultimately forbidden desires and seeks a culprit, playing on Greek superstition and the European supernatural, savagely consummating his love for Ianthe, turning his defence of the Countess's daughter to rape, and suicidally committing incest with his younger sister, his own flesh and blood. This final act brings about a total psychic collapse and terminates the text by repeating the single noun of the title, as if the tale has symbolically devoured itself in a Gothic deadlock of taboo desires. Although the novel Frankenstein is inevitably far more sophisticated in its analysis of overlapping identity than a short tale such as The Vampire ever could be, Polidori's Vampyre is deliciously seductive in the ways in which its narrative twists and turns, disordering the perspectives of its principal character. But many readers, overcome with Byronism and Polidori's claim that the tale has family kinship with the ghost stories of the Via Diodati, cannot see beyond interpretations derived from the author's biography. Rereading The Vampyre, it is clear at what moment Aubrey convinces himself he has been vampirized. As he recovers from his breakdown, Riven is unfathomable, and it is from this abyss that Aubrey dreams he casts his otherworldly moon spell. Like Victor Frankenstein's experimentation, it is brewed from both ancient alchemies and modern science, in this case heliocentric astronomy and tidal forces. During the last stage of the invalid's recovery, Lord Riven was apparently engaged in watching the tideless waves raised by the cooling breeze, or in marking the progress of those orbs circling like our world the moveless sun. Indeed, he appeared to wish to avoid the eyes of all. So the sorcery of the moon combines with the currentless waters of the Saronic Gulf, that's part of the Aegean Sea, to recreate Aubrey as a cold-blooded killer. Polidori is invoking the strange interrelating identities of Victor and the being so intricately dissected in Frankenstein. Certainly The Vampyre is a chamber piece variation of Shelley's symphonic novel, but Polidori, trained in science and psychology, endeavours to chart the extreme mental illness of split personality, hyperdelusion, perverted fantasy and confabulation. So the moon is not magical, except to a madman who populates his world with vampires. My earlier questions can now be answered. Ianthe has gone to the woods to meet Aubrey in the one place that will verify his story, the nucleus of vampirism. She is expecting a tryst with Aubrey, but instead comes face to face with his unfettered lust, which literally exterminates their love. Ianthe's mother has discovered her daughter to be missing, confirming that it was her own decision to visit the woods and has sent the woodsman as a rescue party. Aubrey imagines he hears the words "again baffled" and a loud laugh. An obsolete meaning of the word refers not so much to being foiled as being disgraced. So this is Riven's accusation against Aubrey at having humiliated him a second time, the first time being Aubrey's disclosure to the Countess about his lordship's intentions towards her daughter. Well, possibly, but Aubrey is not a lure to entrap Ianthe for Riven. Riven is not even there, and Aubrey is already living in his own sickening unreality, killing the thing he loves. Although he fabricates a patchy alibi, of which he can convince himself, Aubrey's sanity, reconfigured by rampant carnal desire, is precarious. He knows he is disgraced by his atrocious cravings, and so every challenge to his innocence is aggressively defended. Finally, although Aubrey holds a blood-stained dagger, the locals agree that it was a vampire attack. They are defending Aubrey, which is why these seemingly irrelevant and indeed often ignored details are so important. Vampirism is a metaphor it's a cover for honor slaying. Ianthe has to die because she has brought shame upon her family, even though her shame was orchestrated by her lover, who is also her killer. So too the Countess's daughter, and so too Miss Aubrey. Aubrey is a femicidal maniac in a patriarchal society, intent on the disgrace of seduction and the righteousness of execution. It is through justifying his madly deviant sense of murderous justice that the serial killer Aubrey reworks the events of the narrative. The killings are real, Riven is dead but scapegoated as a supernatural horror. The narrative is a wildly debauched nightmare. When Aubrey discovers the blood-stained scabbards among Riven's effects, it is the smoking gun clue that he himself placed there, just as Frankenstein's being implicated Justine with the miniature. This fabricated evidence proves to the reluctant Aubrey that Riven is a murderer, a vampire, and out and about. Aubrey consequently finds himself in Riven's case of lethal weapons. It's a metaphor for his state of mind and the authorization of his future career, a license to kill. The vampire, then, like Frankenstein, is not a supernatural tale at all. It is perhaps the first psychological thriller and grippingly unnerving study in psychosis and slaughter. And so there are not, as I first considered, two vampires in the tale, Aubrey and Riven. There's not even one vampire, Lord Riven. There are, in reality, no vampires in The Vampire. Thank you very much. I'll just see if on.
Yeah, I think your videos. I think it's coming back, Nick. Can I just immediately say thank you to Nick for that, that bravura reading, especially at the end there. We're counting down from none, many to none vampires. So thank you very much for that. That rereading of The Vampire as the first psychological thriller in which perhaps there are no vampires. You uncoupled the text from Byronic, kind of reflexive Byronic readings, suggesting to us that Aubrey, in some sense, is the vampire. Riven is the doubled version of himself, something like in Frankenstein with the doublings there of Victor as thinking of the creature as his own vampire, himself his own vampire. So it was a brilliant rereading, I think. If I can ask a first question, Nick, when I was rereading it in advance of this session, it struck me. I read, I have to say, more naively probably, Aubrey's madness as a kind of feigned madness, and I guess I was just thinking of Christabel and the spell upon his speech, and so it seemed to me like a feigned madness. But then I was struck that that's a real inconsistency then, because the feigned madness keeps him from his sister and brings about the catastrophe that he's trying to avert. So in a way that doesn't make any kind of sense. But then that's obviously just alluding to Hamlet and the kind of by indirections finding directions out and so on. So how important is it to your rereading, your complete rereading of this text, that Aubrey is actually mad, that there is extreme mental illness here, and that we're not dealing with a case of feigned madness or false madness?
Yeah, there's a very interesting point, Tom. I think as you point out yourself, there's no real reason for Aubrey to pretend to be mad, and it does keep him from his sister, and it excludes him from society. I think really this is why the influence of Frankenstein is so important. If and obviously I now firmly believe this from external and internal evidence. If The Vampire is written after Frankenstein, Polidori is in part inspired by the actual figure of Victor and the series of breakdowns that he goes through, to the extent that he's using very similar language. It's the same sort of pattern, it's the same level of care, and so forth. Now, with Frankenstein, you have the added complication that all of this is told in letters from Captain Walton, who's it admits that he's a fantasist. Admits, I think, on the first page that he's been hallucinating. So we don't have that level of ambiguity, but we do have. We tend to forget what it means to have a mad protagonist, not somebody who's pretending to be mad, but somebody who is mad, and how Aubrey, I think, then creates this world around himself. How it does become a whole fantasy, which can then be used to re-justify the things that actually occur. And so I would say that it is Aubrey who kills Ianthe. It is Aubrey who rapes and kills the Countess's daughter. It is Aubrey who kills his own sister. Now, you might say, well, this it seems sort of quite sort of I don't know, is it too early for this sort of psychological fantasy? Well, not really. This is 20 years after The Monk's been written. And there's also evidence that this was probably partly co-written with Alaric Watts, who worked at the New Monthly as an editor. And I think that it's Watts who introduces the name Riven, for example, which is taken from Caroline Lamb's novel about her affair with Byron, Glenarvan, which had been published just before. In fact, Polidori, in an unpublished second edition, wanted to rename Riven Strongmore. So he wanted to separate it from that sort of Byronic level. But I think that the two of them discussing this, I don't think that it's that unlikely that they can actually sort of see how this delusion can be spun out, because Mary Shelley's already provided a template for this in the levels of uncertainty and sort of hallucinatory experiences that really characterize Frankenstein. I mean, I don't think that this is an idée fixe, but I sort of, I mean, I can't read the story in any other way now, and I think that it becomes a much richer story for seeing Aubrey as the complex sort of portrait of somebody who's falling into a sort of a complete mental collapse. And also let's not forget, Polidori was a physician who was interested in mental states himself. So I like the idea of feigned madness, and I think that's it'll be interesting to develop that. But my instinct is that there's so much evidence, primarily from this being a post-Frankenstein story, that means that it's pursuing that particular model of identity crisis.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think you showed very, very clearly that the dagger seems the key piece of evidence that, as you pointed out, is sort of strangely in Aubrey's hand. Right?
There's sort of somebody who, basically comes to with a bloody dagger, and their sort of loved one lying before them. And the point is that she's covered in blood, and there are tooth marks on her throat. So he has tried to, he's lived out his vampire fantasy. But it is, in terms of circumstantial evidence, you then have to explain why he's not immediately taken off and imprisoned and tried. And this is a story very much about class. It's about very sort of high class and wealthy individuals, men, who are taking terrible advantage of much lower class women. In the case of Ianthe, and that's made clear in the text. This is something that's, her parents are worried about what's going to happen to her, because there's such a gulf between her and Aubrey in terms of their status.
Other questions for Nick?
Yeah, if I could ask a question. Thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed that, and I enjoyed both the readings of, this of basically the vampire being a kind of, of the same ilk as the turn of the screw. This is all imaginary, and then when you combine it with the convincing parallels between the two texts, the Vampire and Frankenstein, Riven is as much a creature, Aubrey's creature, as the creature is Victor's creature. So I really enjoyed the way those two came together. But I'm going to really, bit boringly, ask you about the bibliographical evidence for how to date the vampire, and there's all this. The myth of writing it at the Diodati comes, I think, from Polidori's own journals and stories about this, writing in response to the ghost story challenge. And then it turns up in the New Monthly magazine a year after Frankenstein, with this misattribution to Byron. And so my question is just, what do we know from Polidori's own journals and his connection with Watts and so on? about when it's written and how it emerges, and how much responsibility Polidori has for the Byron misattribution, whether he actually encourages that or discourages that as a way of distracting from the Frankenstein influence.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair question. And I'd say the very short answer is the article's just come out, so you can read it at great length, but I will summarize it here. So the story, what Polidori claims, okay, so the first thing is that Polidori's diary is the only on-the-spot account we have of the Via Diodati. That Mary Shelley's notebooks from that period don't survive, and her comments, she gives two accounts of the ghost story challenge, and they're both slightly different, and they were written at 2 years and at over 10 years distance. So Polidori is on the spot. He keeps his diary, and he gives the date for the ghost story challenge. He records various other things as well in the diary. I mean, he claims that the diary is going to be published because Polidori is an ambitious, aspiring writer, and so anything associated with Byron was saleable. And Byron's publisher knew this, John Murray, and Byron's sort of henchman, really, like John Cam Hobhouse, I mean, worked really energetically and quite aggressively to defend Byron's literary reputation. Now, it's only much later that Polidori claims that he writes the story over 2 or 3 days while he's still in Geneva, and then he leaves it with a lady. And then he claims, and this is in 1819, that it's then suddenly published by the New Monthly magazine, so it's presumably sent by this lady. There's no evidence of that in his diary. When he leaves Byron's employment in September of 1816, he travels around Europe, occasionally meets up with Byron again. They seem to be getting on fine. Byron, in turn, asks John Murray to give Polidori some opportunities to publish, and they remain on quite cordial terms, really. Although certainly Byron's friends, like Hobhouse, can't stand Polly-Dolly, as they disparagingly call him. There's no evidence that Polidori does any serious writing for the rest of that year. Now, what Alaric Watts says, so we then sort of have a 2-year period to the end of 1818. Alaric Watts, in unpublished correspondence in the National Library of Scotland, says that Polidori could not have been ignorant of the imminent publication of the Vampyre. The very strong suggestion is that Polidori himself had delivered the Vampyre and the accompanying letter, which is all taken from his diary, including some of the mistakes. And Fabio Camietti points this out in his article. It must have been written either with Polidori's close cooperation or by Polidori himself. And it does idolize Byron. So this is really putting Polidori in the context, in the company of the New Monthly magazine at the beginning of 1819. Now, my theory is that Polidori had a memory of Byron's story. He certainly didn't have a manuscript. There's only one manuscript that survives. That was sent to John Murray, who published it without Byron's permission. And of course, the Vampyre in that is called Augustus Darvel. He's not called River nor Strongmore or anything. So Polidori is in London trying to make his literary reputation. He's got a diary about Byron. He's got his novel is coming out with the publisher of the New Monthly, Henry Coburn. They've agreed to do that. He's got a book of poems that has just been published by the same publisher. So he's really seeking to cement his relationship with this publisher. Now, the month before, Blackwood's has published The Bride of Corinth, which is Goethe's vampire story. So my sort of suggestion is that the New Monthly seeing the popularity of the Bride of Corinth, want to have their own vampire tale. And Polidori, on the spot, says, well, I remember Byron telling a story, so why don't I finish it off? Polidori was very, very careful to say that it was based on an idea by Byron. He was very concerned that it wouldn't be passed off as being by Lord Byron, but that it was, you know, inspired, that it's, he talks about it's a sort of framework, it's sort of initial groundwork, I think is a word he uses. And so that's how it was going to be printed. But the day before, the day before publication, Henry Cockburn changed the attribution from, from a story being inspired by an idea of Byron's to being by Lord Byron. That caused a huge row, and Alaric Watts immediately resigned. But Alaric Watts felt rather compromised by the whole thing. And also Polidori had already said that he hadn't had anything to do with the delivery of these materials. And he was very concerned about being a gentleman and always resting on his honour. Then Byron's henchmen go into onto the attack, and John Murray and John Cam Hobhouse basically interview everybody involved and try to find out what's happened. And Alaric Watts doesn't actually say it was all Polidori, but he very, very strongly implies that it was. He says it's impossible that Polidori didn't know about this. And this debate rumbles on. Byron is, I think, in Italy at this time, and is only getting the news very late, while his sort of friends in London and Edinburgh are trying to sort out this mess. The story keeps being reprinted as being Byron's, despite strong despite people like sort of Polidori having his letters published in the press and insisting that it's not by Byron, despite sort of Murray and Byron dismissing it as well. And in fact, Goethe said it's the best thing that Byron ever wrote, rather ironically. And it then becomes a sort of, Polidori becomes a figure of fun, and then he's called a plagiarist, then he's called a forger, and it basically destroys his literary career. And so he wants to write a follow-up, a sequel to The Vampire, but he's lost the copyright to it because Cockburn has seized that as well. Nobody's interested in a follow-up. People are more interested in it being by Byron. And Polidori then sort of spends the rest of his short life sort of fishing around, trying to regain some credibility as a writer, which he never succeeds in doing. Then he commits suicide. I think he commits suicide because it's on the date. He's a great enthusiast for Chatterton. He kills himself on the anniversary of Chatterton's death, which can't be a coincidence. So it's rather a it's a story that sort of shows the ferocity of the journal press at the time. I think the periodical press, how they were, very competitive, and always looking for an opportunity to capitalize on sort of literary brands, and Byron was the biggest brand that you could actually make money out of. So it's kind of complicated, so I'm sorry for going on at some length about it, but it's really based on actually going back to those sources and seeing that Polidori does not mention the story until it's already published. And yet the letters suggest, the unpublished letters suggest that he's working behind the scenes with Alaric Watts to actually get the things into print. So it's the evidence that mounts up, really. And there's so we should really be seeing Byron as the originator of the vampire story, although his version isn't published until a few months later. But it's Polidori's version with Alaric Watts that really hits the public, and because it is successful, and it goes through many editions and is very quickly adapted for the stage on both sides of the channel, and that establishes the vampire as a figure in the popular imagination.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks Nick.
So, but as I say, if any graduate students here, I mean, it is always worth going back to the sources to check. You realise that things aren't always quite so straightforward.
Indeed. Question next from Eleanor Bryan.
Hello, hi. First of all, thank you so much. That was a really, really, really great paper. I have two questions. My first question is partly because it took me a little bit longer than I thought it would to download the software to come into the meeting, so I missed the first sort of 5 minutes. I think I tuned in just when you were talking about the specific publication that you've done on this topic. Can I just ask where I'd be able to read that to begin with?
Yeah, well, this started off with my book on the Gothic. Then there's a section in the book on the Vampire.
All right, so this is so the bit that you've written about the publication history of the Vampire is in your book on the Vampire.
No, I just the second edition of that I made a revision to indicate that there's a forthcoming article. So the article is in a journal called Romanticism, published by Edinburgh University Press, and it's in the current issue of Romanticism.
All right then. The other question I was going to ask is kind of a lead on from your answer that you've just given to Adeline. With what you were saying about how the story it's kind of demonstrative of the competitive nature of the publication press at the minute. When you said about Henry Coburn being involved in sort of attributing it to Byron rather than Polidori, is that the same Henry Coburn of, I'm not sure if the first name's Henry, but is it Coburn and Bentley who did the third edition of Frankenstein to secure the dramatic copyright?
I don't know. I'm
just thinking that would be two instances there where the sort of knitting together of the figure of Frankenstein's monster and the vampire have been sort of molded by someone completely external to the writing of the stories themselves.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I've just been fixated on 1819, basically what was going on in that year. I think it would be worth investigating that. There was there's a co-written book on Henry Coburn that I did use for this. One of the authors is John Sutherland. I can't remember, I'm afraid, who the other author is. But it would be worth sort of checking up on that, certainly. I mean, I think Coburn is a terrible person. He comes out of this whole affair. I mean, he's absolutely disreputable. He basically tricks Polidori out of the copyright. And he did pay Polidori for the work, but he paid him a pittance for it because he said that he didn't have the right quality paper. So, you know, Polidori basically cornered him in his office and he said, I'm going to get some better quality paper to write this on. And then he never saw him again. So Polidori he was expecting to get paid and get paid a decent amount. And then Coburn did publish Polidori's attribution of authorship, but Coburn was also publishing, his own excuses. So he was a really completely untrustworthy sort of publisher. Whereas, some people come out of this much more honourably, like Alaric Watts, I think. But I think it does indicate that, you could have an honourable sub-editor working for a very untrustworthy publisher, and then that's bound to cause tension. But it's definitely worth looking up to see whether it's the same Coburn, though. Thank you for that. It was a really interesting point.
Yeah, well, if it is, then that's kind of a key figure in the afterlife of both of the texts. But yeah, I just thought I'd ask because I wasn't 100% sure, but no, I'll look into that. Thank you so much. It was such an interesting.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Can you see the chat, Nick? Or shall I vocalize them? We have a question from Li Shan. Marx in Das Kapital argues that capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. So for Marxist thinkers, we have a one-to-one symbolism, monsters embodying the death force of a single form of social and economic organization, late monopoly capitalism. Is Marx's theory applicable to this novel?
Well, I don't know whether Marx's theory is applicable to the to the novel, I think that what's interesting is Marx's imagery here, because as one or two people have pointed out, such as Mark Neocleus, vampire, well, undead imagery, but particularly vampire imagery, saturates Marx's writing. And in fact, Marx did plan to write an essay about vampires, which never completed. So he's constantly referring to bloodsuckers and the living dead, and to bodies rising from graves. To think about the Communist Manifesto, for example. I think the opposite is probably more likely. I mean, Marx is drawing on the popular imagery of the vampire tale and the popular conception of the vampire, which changes a lot from the early 18th century through to the 19th century. So writers such as Polidori are influencing Marx, because Polidori is helping to establish the figure of the vampire, although only one among many writers who is actually doing so. I think it's worth just adding as a footnote that there's also an introduction to Polidori's story of the vampire, which I think was written by Alaric Watts, which gathers together all the European folklore surrounding the vampire from the 18th century, and was published with Polidori's story throughout the century, and yet gives a rather different account of the vampire than Polidori gives. So that's an important source. So it's a more sort of factual introduction to folklore beliefs that really rides on the coattails of Polidori's story and is disseminated. That it's really more that helps to spread the idea, the popularity of the vampire, that's then taken up by other writers. I mean, of course, you can do a Marxist reading of many things. I mean, you could see it in terms of the base and the superstructure and the ideology and the particularly the publishing circumstances that we've just been talking about. You can see it in terms of the sort of the aristocracy becoming less and less relevant. But I think that the influence is the other way around. I'd say the influence is of vampire fiction on Marx rather than Marx on analysing vampire fiction. A very interesting question, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Next question is from Zhengxin Lin. And then Tim, I think, Tim Fulford.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, yes.
Great. Hi, thanks for your fascinating talk. I have a question about the relationship between Polidori and Byron. There is a writing on the Gothic Dublin relationship and also homophobia issues, and also there is an article I read recently talking about how Frankenstein manifests the sign of homophobia because there is a weak separation between a male friendship and also male sexuality. So I'm wondering, I also, when I read the vampire novel, I noticed there is a kind of fascination from the author. He described how he really fascinated with the character. So I'm wondering if there is these reflections on the actual relationship between the Polidori and Lord Byron.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. There's no evidence that the sort of, I don't know how to describe it, the pansexual Byron and Polidori had any sort of relationship. Polidori spent a lot of the time at Geneva in a literary set that was run by an aristocratic woman there. So he seems to spend a lot of the time in female company, and also with Mary Godwin, as she was then, became Mary Shelley. And he also appears to have visited a brothel and not taken any precautions. He got a strict telling off from Byron about this, that if you're going to actually do things like that, then you need to take precautions. And he subsequently had heterosexual relationships. But I think you probably can read at least a homosocial and possibly a homophobic relationship between Riven and Aubrey in the book. That's not a relationship I really pursued, because it seemed to me that what needed explaining was the deaths of 3 female characters and Aubrey's part in that. But I think that it could be seen as another repressed passion of Aubrey's, that there is a potentially some sort of homosexual desire there for Riven, and certainly because Riven ignores women and yet is incredibly charismatic and attractive to them. Yes, that could certainly be developed, but so my sort of focus was on trying to explain the how these characters had died and really what happens at the end. But yes, I think you could certainly argue that. It's a very good point.
We have.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Amy and Nick, for your answer. We have one more question to come back to, which is about Tolkien. But before that, I think we have a question from Tim Fulford.
Yeah, we're coming, Tom. We're just getting the camera going.
Hello. Nice to see you.
See you, Nick. Yes, via China. Yeah,
Nice to see you.
I missed the first part of your talk, so apologies if you've been into all this. And just wondering if you wanted to say some more about the previous of hinterland of vampires. I'm thinking that Southey is vicariously present there in Geneva. We know that Talaba, and there are vampires there. Yeah, you want to pursue that at all?
Yes, I mean, the line's not very good. I think you're asking about the use of vampires in English poetry before Polidori's story. And, as you said, is Southey's Talaba the Destroyer. There's also Byron's The Giaour. Both of those poems are important because they both have footnotes that, rather like the introduction to Polidori's story, go into European folklore and really outline the beliefs of vampire occurrences, and that's drawn from 18th century sources such as Augustin Calmet and those sort of various sort of narrative accounts of vampires. It's interesting that the Byron, when he's sort of entangled in this particular episode, writes a letter saying he's got no interest in vampires. And then, of course, everybody points out, well, you've published on them. So how can you say you've got no interest in them? And then Murray publishes without permission Byron's own fragments of the vampire story. So in fact, Byron's got quite a lot to say about vampires, but he wants to distance himself from this. I don't know what sort of Southey's response to Polidori was. You doubtless know more about this than I do. I'd be interested to follow that up to see whether he positions himself in relationship to Polidori's story. Somebody who is alive to this, I think, and this is more speculative, is Keats, who writes La Belle Dame sans Merci just a week or two after Polidori's story is first published. So I would see Keats as sort of taking the next step, following Goethe and Polidori, and really absorbing vampires into his poetry in the same way that Coleridge does with Christabel. The other British poet who's included writing about vampires is Walter Scott in Rokeby, who has a much more sort of British folkloric vampire scene. So we've got sort of quite interesting comparisons here. We've got, because, as you say, sort of Southey's is an Islamic vampire, the Giaour is a Turkish vampire, Walter Scott's is a British vampire, Goethe is an ancient Greek vampire, Polidori's is an aristocratic English vampire, and Keats is a sort of like an elf vampire of some sort. So this is it's interesting to me how this sort of whole area sort of spreads before it then becomes more focused again. into the 19th century vampire tradition that eventually leads to Dracula, which then sort of really fixes the figure.
Thanks, Nick.
No, very good to see you.
And speaking of elven vampires, I think we're really at our time. So I think, if we may, can we just go back for one last question, which I promised Jinkai we'd return to. So Jinkai in the chat was asking about Tolkien, noticing your forthcoming book, Nick, and asking, do you think Tolkien's legendarium contains traces of the Gothics or vampire legends that preceded him? Thank you. So a nice easy question to close with, Nick. Can you?
Thank you for that question.
For us.
Thank you very much indeed for that question. It's something I could talk about at great length. I've actually published a long essay on Tolkien and the Gothic, but it's only published in Spanish. So perhaps one day there'll be an English version of that. Now, I think there are definite Gothic elements in Tolkien's legendarium that are drawn from Gothic fiction. You get vampires in the story of Beren and Luthien, for example. Sauron, for example, in that is actually figured as a vampire. But that's because that particular tale draws on a more English folklore. Tolkien himself said he didn't like Gothic literature. He didn't like 19th century Gothic literature. He actually preferred adventure stories and science fiction to the Gothic. However, there is an important basis, which is in the ancient Goths. And Tolkien was fascinated by the Goths who overran the Roman Empire in the beginning of the 5th century. And Tolkien lectured on this. He actually tried to reinvent the Gothic language. Had a sort of a real fascination, wrote Gothic poetry, even spoke in Gothic at a school debate, and was taught by the Gothic expert when he was an undergraduate. Now, I think one of the reasons why Tolkien is rather doesn't really appreciate 19th century Gothic fiction is because a lot of it is predicated on the Reformation, on the English Reformation. And Tolkien is a medievalist, and so the Reformation is a break between the continuity of the Middle Ages with the present. Tolkien's much more Puginian. He's like Augustus Pugin, who in contrast deplores the Reformation and is trying to reinvent the Middle Ages as having a contemporary significance and relevance and meaning. And yet a lot of Gothic fiction, at least in my reading of it, is very much about a Protestant world being haunted by a Catholic world, and it's about the guilt of Reformation and sort of subsequent religious and political history. So I think Tolkien's aware of that, and it's written about quite explicitly throughout the 19th century. So Tolkien's trying to connect with the Middle Ages in a way that isn't haunted, rather than in the Gothic mode, which is a much more haunted way of actually relating to that particular era. So the thing, well, I'll just end by saying is that Tolkien's writing is so multifarious, it's so broad, and he wants to get every influence in. It's also very ambiguous and contradictory, and a lot of people write about Tolkien and present him as a sort of seamless, consistent, comprehensive writer. He's not. He's the opposite. He's full of loose ends and uncertainties and deliberate contradictions that you could certainly, and as I have done, you could certainly write a fairly convincing essay about Tolkien's use of the Gothic, even though he did state that he wasn't interested in Gothic fiction. And so you look at all the different sorts of obscurity. He's got quite a Burkean sense of the sublime, I think. He's also inspired by Coleridge's theory of the imagination in what he calls subcreation in the secondary world. He's clearly inspired by the Romantics. He's clearly inspired by Shakespeare's supernatural plays. There's a lot of Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear in Tolkien. In fact, he lectured on Hamlet. So perhaps the influence is inescapable. It's there, but talking to some of those writers where you can, I think you have to be careful about quoting him on his own writing. He's a very good writing which you actually trust the tale and not the teller, which is quite a Gothic point on which to to end.
Thank you, Nick. It seems like an hour and a half seminar is nowhere near enough to cover all of this. It seems more like we need a full conference or something on Tolkien, the Gothic, so on. Maybe one day. Can I invite everyone to show Nick our appreciation again and thank him for the wonderful talk.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Tom, and thanks to everybody for giving up the time to listen today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to close the Zoom session now. Bye-bye. See you all next time.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Take care.
Bye. Cheers, Nick.